Existential isolation. The process of deepest inquiry, a process that Heidegger refers to as unconsmental, leads us to recognize that we are finite, that we must die, that we are free, and that we cannot escape our freedom. We also learn that the individual is inexorably alone, as freedom and death are concepts that traditionally lie outside of the psychotherapist domain. In early chapters, I felt it necessary to elaborate on their specific relevance to psychotherapy. The situation is different with isolation since it is a familiar concept and arises frequently in everyday therapy. In fact, isolation is so familiar and used in so many different fashions that my first task must be to define it in an existential context. The clinician, it seems to me, encounters three different types of isolation: interpersonal, intrapersonal, and existential. Interpersonal isolation, generally experienced as loneliness, refers to isolation from other individuals. It is a function of many factors: geographic isolation, the lack of appropriate social skills, heavily conflicted feelings about intimacy, or a personality style, such as schizoid, narcissistic, exploitative, or judgmental, that precludes gratifying social interaction. Cultural factors play an important role in interpersonal isolation. The decline of intimacy sponsoring institutions, the extended family, the stable residential neighborhood, the church, local merchants, the family doctor, has, in the United States at least, inexorably lead to increased interpersonal estrangement. Intrapersonal isolation is a process whereby one partitions off parts of oneself. Freud used the term isolation to describe a defense mechanism, especially apparent in obsessional neurosis, in which an unpleasant experience is stripped of its effect, and its associative connections are interrupted, so that it is isolated from ordinary processes of thought. Harry Stack Sullivan was particularly interested in the phenomenon by which one excludes experience from conscious awareness and makes parts of the psyche inaccessible to the self. He referred to this process as dissociation, abandoning the term repression, and elevated it to a central position in his schema of psychopathology. In the contemporary psychotherapy scene, isolation is used not only to refer to formal defense mechanisms but in a more casual way to connote any form of fragmentation of the self. Thus, intrapersonal isolation results whenever one stifles one's own feelings or desires, accepts outs or shoulds as one's own wishes, distrusts one's own judgment, or buries one's own potential. Intrapersonal isolation is a widely used and current paradigm of psychopathology. Modern theorists such as Homey, Fromm, Sullivan, Maslow, Rogers, and may all posit that pathology is the result of obstructions that, occurring early in life, act to derail the individual's natural development. Carl Rogers, in a discussion of Ludwig Binswanger's famous case of Ellen West, clearly describes intrapersonal isolation. Though as a child she was wholly independent of opinion of others, she now is completely dependent on what others think. She no longer has any way of knowing what she feels or what her opinion is. This is the loneliest state of all, an almost complete separation from one's autonomous organism. Contemporary therapists focus closely on the goal of helping patients reintegrate previously split-off parts of themselves. In a research project that I described in Chapter 6, successful patients were asked to rank order 60 factors in therapy according to degree as helpfulness. 5. The single most frequently chosen item by far was discovering and accepting previously unknown or unacceptable parts of myself. To make oneself whole again is the goal of most psychotherapies, excluding symptom-oriented ones. Paris, for example, christened his approach Gestalt therapy to emphasize his dedication to the aim of wholeness. Note in this regard the common etymological root of whole: heal, healthy, hail. In the remainder of this chapter I shall focus on a third form of isolation, existential isolation. This is not to say that interpersonal and intrapersonal isolation are not crucial issues in clinical work. But if I am to keep this treatise within manageable length, I must be content to recommend to the reader the relevant literature. There will be many occasions, however, when I shall refer to interpersonal isolation, for they are closely related to existential isolation. Interpersonal and existential isolation especially share a common boundary. The types of isolation are similar subjectively, that is, they may feel the same as in masquerade for one another. Frequently, therapists mistake them and treat a patient for the wrong type of isolation. Furthermore, their boundaries are semi-sparing. Existential isolation, for example, is often kept within manageable bounds through interpersonal affiliation. All these issues will be discussed in due time, but first existential isolation must be defined.